Hi, and welcome to the User Adoption webinar presented by Maury Hanigan, CEO of Sparc. This presentation was originally given at the Talent Blend Conference in Washington, D.C., and based on the extraordinary response, the information is now being made available for a wider audience. Our presenter today is one of the leading experts on talent acquisition. As CEO of Sparc, Maury is the principal design architect of the new recruiting tool that won the HR Tech Product of the Year and the Mobile Recruiting Award. Sparc has been adopted by Fortune 100 corporations and tech startups, and Maury will share the best practices on user adoption from a wide range of leading employers. With that, let me turn it over to Maury and an information-packed presentation.
Thanks. I'm excited about this presentation today. I think user adoption is really important. I watch so many organizations go through really disciplined and extensive processes to look at new tools and evaluate their costs and benefits, and then oftentimes they don't get the benefits that they thought they would because they haven't had either a successful or a complete user adoption. So it's important to understand this really critical component of implementing new tools. So let's start today with a quick quiz. You can either keep track of your score in pen or paper or possibly even keep track of it in your head. But think of something you implemented, either something you're about to implement or something you implemented just recently. We'll go through each of these. If your answer is in column 1, give yourself 1 point. If it's in column 2, 2 points, or column 3, 3 points. So quickly, just the number of stakeholder groups affected. If it was 1 to 5, you get 1 point. More than 5, 5 to 15, 2 points, 15 plus 3 points. Next, the impact to stakeholders on core competencies. Low, medium, high. The number of individuals affected by the change. The centralized or decentralized locations. The number of international users. This can have a huge impact. The required simultaneous changes to strategy, processes, technology, and skills. The degree of cross-functional collaboration and involvement. 1 to 2 business units, 2 to 4 business units, 5 plus business units. The degree to which departments are siloed. Whether users have been involved in system design. Time frame for implementation. The significance to the business of the change. Is it critical to bottom line, not critical? Involvement, presence of multiple consultants, vendors, and or third parties. And lastly, the degree of executive leadership consensus regarding the future vision. So just go through and keep track of how many of those you had given yourself a 1, 2, or 3, add them up, and you can just ballpark this. The specific score isn't as important. But if your total is something less than 18, you've got a fairly simple, not to say unimportant, but fairly simple adoption in line. If you're 18 to 30, you need a real plan. You've got something sizable here that you're dealing with. And if you're over 30, this is a major implementation that you need to have an entire team help you with. This isn't a one-person implementation. This is something that will require a real coordinated effort. So part of the theme today is going to be looking at what you're implementing and what tools make sense, and really sizing the implementation and the user adoption program to the actual project that's being implemented. We get asked all the time, what is good user adoption? And unfortunately, the answer is one that we all hate. It depends. If you're going to add a calendar to a project management piece of software that people are using, it's pretty simple. You tell them to look for little calendars, click on it, and a calendar will pop up. If you're going to implement a new ATS, you should find another job quickly because it's always a bear to implement an ATS. But you want to make sure that you match the effort that you're making with the complexity of the project. And why does that matter? The first one is you want to make sure that you allocate your resources well. You want to watch your costs and spend your money well. That's the obvious piece. But you also need to manage expectations. You want to make sure everyone's on board, that the expectations are realistic, that they understand what kind of either savings you're going to get or time you're going to save or how quickly it's going to be adopted. You may have an implementation that you think is wildly successful, but management may not see it that way because they didn't understand what was involved up front. And lastly, it's important because you need to build credibility. If you're implementing a very simple system and you over-communicate, you set up training that's tedious and for something that's intuitive, people are just going to tune you out going forward. On the other hand, if you implement a very complex system and you don't provide sufficient resources, people will get frustrated, they'll be angry at the system, they'll be angry at you, and you'll lose your reputation and your respect. So it's very easy to underestimate or overestimate what kind of effort is needed here, and you need to get this one right. In this quick webinar, we're going to go over a couple of things. We're going to talk about the things you need to do before you buy, before you actually spend your money, developing your plan, what those components are, the training and the different kinds of training. We'll talk about resistance, because you'll get it. No matter what you're doing, you'll get someone or some group of people who will be resistant. We'll talk about success and what that looks like. And then finally, resources. I'm going to go through a lot of information fairly quickly here. I'll give you a bibliography at the end if there's more information you'd like to dig in and go into in more depth. But before we start, let's acknowledge the cloud that we're all hanging under. And that cloud is the Google curse. The Google curse is the expectation that you can type into your computer what you want to know in plain English and you'll get the answer. So your recruiters want to be able to type in, how many candidates did we interview in the central region for the sales account job in second quarter of 2015? And they want the number to pop up on their screen. Now, unfortunately, there are very few systems that work that way. They don't really want to go to the reports tab and pull that down and fill out the time frame and all of that. They want a quick, easy answer. But most of the software or products that you're implementing aren't quite that straightforward. So your users want, your users want the software, they expect it to just work. They expect it to be easy. They don't want to learn something new every 6 months. None of us do, really. They don't want to ask for help, and they just want to get their job done. So those are their expectations. To the extent that you can meet those expectations or at least manage those expectations, you'll be ahead of the game. So let's talk about what happens before you buy. There are a couple of really key elements here. The first one is to assess the scope of what you're doing. The exercise I just took you through when we started was the magnitude of change assessment. There are a couple of other. There's an organizational culture assessment. There's a change inventory, a stakeholder assessment. These are all developed by Erica Thaler. Emails here, and it's in the bibliography as well. If this is a major project, you might want to really start to size what kind of resistance, what kind of scope, what kind of magnitude you're going to be up against. So again, you size your implementation appropriately for the project that you're undertaking. And here's a great definition of change management. It's a systematic process that mitigates risks. It's an actionable, process-driven effort with work streams of activities and tasks. It has templates, forms, checklists, and quality measurements. And the reason I bring this up is it's important to understand that implementation isn't just about sending out some emails, scheduling some training classes. User adoption is a real thing. It's a real project. It has its own life. And it starts before you even buy the product. Before you buy, a couple things that you want to do. The first one is to create your adoption team. I'd highly recommend that on your adoption team you include a super user, an observer, somebody who's not really going to be involved in it but will be somehow impacted by it, and a champion, a senior executive who will really go to bat for you and really want to see this succeed. You don't need to have them involved in every vendor presentation, but before you actually purchase something, sit down with your adoption team and explain to them what you looked at, the pros and cons of each, what you're planning to buy or what's down to the finalist list, and get their input. You'll uncover a multitude of facets of the project that you hadn't even anticipated. There may be something that you decided not to pay for because you didn't think the organization would use it. You'll find out, yes, they really would use that, or vice versa. You're buying features that you're going to find out people say, nah, not so much. We're not really interested in that. That really wouldn't make our life that much quicker. But you'll get really valuable feedback when you start this up front. It will give your adoption team a sense of ownership if they're involved in the selection, and then they become your canaries, the folks who find out if things are going wrong, if there's hesitation about the project or problems with it. They become your evangelists. They also become your help desk. So that to build your team before you start is really, really helpful. You also want to pilot with multiple users. Try it with your finance group. Try it with your sales group. Try it with some of your tech folks. You'll get different feedback from all of those folks. Try it internationally. As we all know, that just internet speeds are radically different from country to country, not to mention international HR law, employment law. So you want to try, if this is something that's going to be used globally, make sure you pilot it globally before you use it. Try it on mobile, and almost any vendor today is going to say, oh yes, we're completely mobile compatible, we're mobile friendly. Mobile can mean that the screen's resized. That doesn't mean they're really usable on mobile. We'd really encourage you to make sure that the system is as easy to use and as robust on mobile as it is on a screen, because mobile is where everything is going. And we just saw recently that India just surpassed 1 billion cell phones. China is well past 1 billion. The U.S. is more than 500 million cell phones. This is how we all get information and do business, so that's important. And lastly, do it in the field. We had a client who had some retail stores in some fairly remote locations, and when they tried Sparc, they realized they had to make some adjustments just because of bandwidth speeds in remote locations. So it's important to do all of those. And lastly, before you buy, determine your success metrics. What does success look like? Is it the % of users by a certain date? Is it number of transactions per period? Is it a dollar cost savings that you're going after? Is it time saved? All of these things are valid. They'll vary from product to product, but you want to define these things first, and then most importantly, measure your baseline data. Make sure you have good comparisons, so once you implement the new product, you can go back and really show that you achieve the results you set out to achieve. I can't tell you how often we hear things like, well, we can't really compare this to last quarter because last quarter either had holidays or we had a hiring freeze or we had a hiring, real surge, or we can't compare it to a year ago because something happened there. Make sure you think about this and you've got good, clean data before you even start. You also, if you're going to implement any sizable program, you want to include an adoption strategy and a budget in your RFP. Training can be substantial, even travel can be substantial, and you never know what kind of resources your vendor may have available. So start to spec it right from the very beginning, and make sure you allocate resources to troubleshoot and improve your user experience and fix the bugs, because you'll have all of those. Vendors may be very helpful in suggestions and helping you work through that. And lastly, before you buy, make sure you have executive sponsorship. Is there at least one senior person who can very clearly see and articulate what the business need is for implementing this new product? Do they see the need? Do they understand what the business problem is that it solves? And will they use it? All of those things can be really helpful in terms of them really getting behind you and moving things forward. We'd encourage you to, if you're buying software, to do it with things that have executive dashboards so that people can, from a big picture standpoint, take a look at how the software is being used, how many people are using it, what kind of results they're getting. That keeps them engaged and keeps them involved, but do it at the right level. They don't want to get down into the granular information. They want to see, perhaps enterprise-wide, what's going on and how things are progressing. Now, talking about designing your plan. Let's talk about the elements and how you design your plan. And how you design your plan will depend a lot on how you're going to roll out the new product. There are basically 3 types of implementation. There's the big bang, where everything changes on a given date. So as of October 31st, everyone will be using the new software. There's the parallel system, where you run the new system and the old system in parallel for a while. We tend to see this with payroll systems, where you continue to run the old system just in case there are any glitches at the same time that you're running the new one. And then there's the rollout, where you start with one division, one business unit, one location, and you roll it through the organization. There are pros and cons of all of these, but each one will require a different kind of user adoption. Obviously, if you're doing big bang, if the entire organization needs to be ready to go on a given date, not a lot of room for trial and error learning in the way that you develop the training and so forth. So think about how you're going to modify your user adoption based on how you're rolling out the new product. And then when you start, you want to start with a teaser up front, which announces the new end result, including what's staying the same and what's improving. And it's very important here that you announce the end result. Don't announce that we're going to be implementing a new product and what the features are and a lot of talk about the product. It's much more compelling to announce that you're going to be implementing a new tool that's going to allow all hiring managers to provide a video to potential candidates right at the beginning of the recruiting process. And you're still going to use your same ATS. All the candidates are still going to apply to the same ATS. But let people see what this new capability is going to be. That will generate some excitement. And then keep announcing as you roll out your results, your completion. Keep people in the loop. Don't badger them with emails, but let them know that things are moving along, they're going well, people are getting results. All of these things will help you build momentum with your implementation. And when you think about your communication, think about who needs to know what and who should tell them. So for your very senior executives, that might be a personal meeting that talks very high level about the goals and the timing and the cost. It's probably delivered one-on-one with the senior executive. But when you get to stakeholders, this may be your regional salespeople. They probably don't need one-on-one meetings, but they probably need something more than an email. Possibly you might want to have this announced at a district sales meeting and delivered by the regional sales manager. So in that case, you'd need to prepare talking points, perhaps some visuals for that individual to present it. And that may be very different than the users who may need one-on-one meetings or may need group meetings with very specific information. So put together a matrix and think about who are the folks that need to know about this, what do they need to know, and who's the best person or best people or best delivery mechanism for the communication. And be very purposeful about this. It's important that someone credible deliver the right information at the right time. That way it becomes their project rather than your project. You want people to have a sense of ownership. You want each of your different groups to feel like it's something they're getting, that their management is in favor of and advocating for. And you can do that by having them deliver information. So take advantage of that whenever you can. And there are a couple of tricks of the trade to getting this information out there. One of them is to consider a third-party implementation team. It's a way to escape the mom syndrome. For any of you that have kids, you know that you can say something particularly to your teenagers and they'll roll their eyes and just basically ignore you. But if they hear that very same information from a peer, all of a sudden it's brilliant. The same thing can happen in companies. If you're out there telling folks constantly that they should be using this, they should be operating a certain way, they can tune you out sometimes. But if you bring in a third party who can talk about best practices, about what other companies are doing, about the results they're getting, they sometimes come with more credibility, and that can really help get the attention of the folks that you really want to have briefed on all of this. You might also want to use elements of gamification, just things like contests for the most postings or awards for the best videos. Don't be afraid to let people have fun with whatever the new tool is. You don't want to get too gimmicky, but if people have fun, if there's a reason, they get recognition, all of those things are really powerful ways to get people to try something new. And don't underestimate the value of free food. You'd be amazed who will show up for a slice of pizza. You may want to hold training sessions at lunch and order a half dozen pizza pies and see who comes and will sit and listen. Food can be a great motivator for people and a great way to get people kind of talking and engaging with you. And lastly, be a storyteller and tell a story. You hear this all the time with politicians. They'll start out and they'll tell you about Mary from St. Louis, and she couldn't pay for, whatever. And they bring it down to an individual level and tell a story about an individual and how they were affected. To the extent that you can do that, whether it's talking about a candidate who didn't even consider your organization as a potential employer, and they saw something that really changed how they perceived the organization or something that piqued their interest, that can be a compelling story. If you talk about a recruiter who had 30 open recs on their docket and how they were able to save time, sometimes bringing it down to the personal level can be very compelling. And all of these things help get you the attention and enthusiasm of the people that you wanted to convince. Now let's talk about the actual training that goes on in an implementation plan. This is where people get narrow and forget that there are lots of ways that you can train people. Just some of the options are everything from a written manual, and that could be a physical manual or electronic document. You can have interactive tutorials where people can go through and actually click on things and learn and see how it works. You can have video tutorials that just run straight through but allow a user to watch a piece of software being used or any kind of product being used. You can have traditional classroom instructor-led training. You can set up a help desk. You can set up wikis where people can ask questions and see other answers and get answers. You can do a live demo. You can set up whether it's a WebEx or GoToMeeting or JoinMe, any of those, and do a live demo for groups of people. You can have a super user designated who can help people in a given department. You can have user group meetings where people get together and talk about what they're doing and what's working and what's not. There's a whole range of ways to get information to individuals. And again, we go back to what's the complexity of what you're doing, how new is it to people, how much does it change their current behavior, how much knowledge do they have to do. Some of these things will be ideal, some of them will be completely inappropriate. But go through and don't just narrow yourself to, oh, we have to have a training class, or we have to have just one way to do all of it. There are lots and lots of options. And with that, I particularly love this graph by Fred Asher, who laid out for the kinds of changes and how much an individual was impacted by the change, what kind of training was appropriate for them. And this specific example may not apply to yours, but I think it's useful to think of it this way. Who are the people? How much training do they need? How are they going to be impacted? What's the most efficient way, whether just because geographically they're spread out, time, hours, and so forth. Think about all the different ways, and you can put together a matrix that makes a very efficient use of time and money and gets the job done that you want done. So now let's talk about resistance, because as mentioned before, you're going to get some. The toughest adopters to convert are either employees who get no direct benefit, and this might be a recruiting coordinator who's asked to put an accounting code on everything that he or she does. It may make things much easier for accounting and for a lot of other people, but doesn't really help that individual's job or efficiency or satisfaction or anything at all. It's just more work for them. There are also employees who are actually hurt by implementation. Almost anything you do, there's probably somebody or some group of people in the organization who are worse off because of it. It might be a recruiter who keeps, good candidates in their back pocket. Someone that they didn't hire for one job, and rather than putting that individual into your ATS or your candidate management system, may just keep that information on the side. So the next time they have an open rec, they pull it out and they've got somebody ready to go. There are lots of reasons why people will resist implementation, and you need to be aware of it and you need to deal with it. I won't go into a lot of detail about this, but there are basically three types of resistance. There's the cognitive resistant, which is someone who's just decided to resist. It's like, I'm not going to be bothered with this. I actually talked to someone who said, there's a strategy around here that if we ignore enough of these initiatives, eventually they'll go away. And you're going to deal with some of that. People who say, oh, if I just don't do this, they'll stop asking me to do it. There's also emotional resistance, and that's where someone is either afraid they might be replaced, they're afraid they're going to be embarrassed, they're afraid that a shortcoming will show up. There's some real emotional, and these may be subconscious, but there's some real emotional barriers and reasons why they don't want to adopt whatever the new tool is. And then lastly is the behavioral. They do the same kind of behaviors over and over, and because it's such a routine for them, they don't actually implement the new tools. And a completely unrelated example, I think the biggest example of this is lots of folks who go to the grocery store, want to bring those reusable bags with them, and they get there and they just plain forget because their behavior is so instinctual that they don't think to change their behavior. So all these things can have an impact. Sometimes it can be helpful to understand what you're dealing with, but in general, just recognize that there is a lot of resistance, or there can be a lot of resistance, and you're going to run into it. So how do you address these? There's the rational approach, and this is basically, talk to people like they were adults and hope that they are adults. Tell them what's changed. Is it the candidate expectations that have changed? Is that why you need to adopt something new, why you need to make changes to the way you've been doing things? Are they competitive practices? Do you need to change just to stay competitive? Are other folks in your industry doing things that are making you look dated, and you just need to keep up if you're going to get the best talent? Is it a cost issue? Is it just not financially viable to do things the way you've been doing things before? Or is it organizational change? Are you centralizing, decentralizing, acquiring someone, spinning something off? There may be lots of reasons why. And if you talk people through, that can really help them understand there's a really good reason why this change is happening and why they want to get on board. And then there's the other approach, which is don't give them any choice. Zero other options. One of the places we see this the most is if you don't bring in a candidate through the process, we don't ever put them on payroll. And there's no other option. If there wasn't a wreck in the system and they didn't get hired to the system and we don't have all the tax forms for them, we don't pay them. So you get tremendous adoption of those kinds of policies. So there's that option. There's also just the social pressure of this is the right way to do it. This is how folks do things now. This is how we recruit people. This is how we source talent. This is how we go to market. This is how we build our employer brand. All of those things, when you set the expectation that this is the right and professional way to do it, you can convince a lot of people to join you. And most importantly, don't make exceptions for people. If you let one or two people do it the old way, their own way, you will undermine and sabotage your effort. It's also important to keep in mind that rumors can really impact adoption. Just be aware if there's a buzz that starts that the product is full of bugs or the company was too cheap to buy the features you needed or somebody over at Allied has this and nobody there likes it, that can really, really negatively impact your adoption. This is where your adoption team is really helpful. If they're out there, if they hear what's going on, you can get ahead of some of these rumors. But it can be very dangerous to have this sort of side conversation about why this new product isn't going to work or why it doesn't really meet people's needs or what's wrong with it. And that can sabotage the very best plan that you've put together. So have your adoption team, ask them to keep their ears open, and when a rumor gets started, make sure you're on top of it and you address it, and address it honestly. That will help build credibility for you. And lastly, we get to success. What does this look like? First of all, set yourself up for success. Communicate your performance metrics before, during, and after. Let people know what you're shooting for. As you're getting close to them, let them know that. And once you've achieved them, make sure that people know this. And don't be afraid to report intangible gains. There will hopefully be, whether it's cost savings or time to fill or whatever the tangible and quantitative metrics are, don't be afraid to report the qualitative. Whether it's candidates that are coming in more excited for an interview, or interviews that seem to be smoother because candidates are less nervous, or whatever, you'll get some feedback from people. When things are working well, there'll be all sorts of intangible gains around whatever you've done. Don't be afraid to report those. Just because you can't measure them doesn't mean they aren't valuable and they aren't real. And whether you're asked for it or not, create a completion report. If you hit your goals, that's great. You absolutely should get credit for that and document that. If you don't hit your goals, do a thoughtful analysis of what happened. And this can build as much respect for you as everything else. Why didn't you meet your goals? What happened in the implementation? What were the pieces that were missing? This isn't an indictment of you. It's an objective assessment of what worked and what didn't. And that's really important. It will help give you credibility for the next thing that you implement. And the best I love this success for any new implementation. The installation means it works. The implementation means it's used. Integration means it's invisible. It's just one of the things that is out there. It's like the operating system on your computer. You don't even know it's there. It's there and it works. And you're just part of the fabric of what you do. So here, lastly, are some additional resources. I'll keep this on the screen for a while. If you really want to dig in and go deeper into any of these, I've tried to cover a lot of information fairly quickly, but all of these can be helpful resources for you. And lastly, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I make it a point to respond to all emails in less than 24 hours. If you have questions or comments, I'd be delighted to hear from you and answer any questions that you've got. With that, I'll turn it back to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Maury. That was terrific. Our most frequent comment was on how helpful it is to think broadly about all the options for delivering information. I think people fall into ruts and often try to apply the same tools to all jobs. This was great, thank you. If you have any questions about the content or would like information on using Sparc to get your jobs noticed and improve your candidate response, you can reach Maury again at the email address on your screen. Thank you for your time today, and we look forward to connect with you on future webinars.